Hiya, Molly.
Hello, how are you?
I'm okay. Introduce yourself. Who are you and where do you come from?
Oh, it's like blind
It
date.
is. And behind the screen, I've got.
I was just about to say tonight, Matthew, I'm going to be, but that's actually stars in their eyes, so I was combining the two. So yeah, my name's Molly, Molly Ty. I'm a By day, I work in the violence against women and girls sector, so and have done for a long time. So I've worked mainly around sort of domestic abuse. But by night, and increasingly a bit more of my day, as things have sort of taken off a little bit, I am a music journalist writing primarily, or pretty much exclusively at this point, about punk music. It didn't sort of start off that way, but now I'm mainly writing about punk for my own website, Punk Rock Philosophy, and I have just had a book released called Rebel Grrrls: The Real Story of Women in Punk. So that's I was writing that for a very long time as well.
And you were the editor of Punctuation magazine for a while.
Yeah, I was in on the ground when it started. So Punctuation magazine, I was I started off mainly as a sort of features writer. So like to write a lot of the long form pieces that were on the website. And then I got the post of UK editor from 2022 to 2024, and then left in 2024 and started Punk Rock Philosophy around about that time. Which Punk Rock Philosophy is very different from Punctuation magazine, so there isn't really like a huge amount of overlap. So still have a good relationship with everything that Punctuation is doing, but moved on to my own thing.
So tell us more about the book.
Rebel Grrrls: The Real Story of Women in Punk. It came out in the UK the month before, so June. It's been out for a few weeks in the US. It's my labour of love, so it's I worked on it for a really long time, and it's been really, really overwhelming in a really good way to see it finally have a physical form, when for so many years it was just floating about in my head, or a very, very long Word document. Basically, it's about the female fans of punk, and how punk has been received, how it's treated its female fans, how it's impacted its female fans through all of the different waves and sort of subgenres of punk. So starting from the 1970s and a kind of UK based sort of burgeoning punk scene, through to some of the major waves of punk. So obviously there's always lots going on in terms of the underground scenes and other kind of subgenres, but the book kind of goes chronologically from the UK 1970s through to American hardcore and the kind of no wave scene, through riot girl, pop punk, ska punk, emo, and kind of right through to the sort of radical punk resurgence of the 2010s. And throughout the whole book, I wanted to look at what was going on in the sort of social and political context of each of those waves, each of those scenes. And so therefore, what were those punk scenes reacting to? What were they responding to? So the Reagan years in the case of American hardcore, through to sort of the rise of the resurgence of the far right and kind of strongman politics in the 2010s, and kind of all of that. So setting it in the context, and then looking at some of the things that defined those particular eras, and how those themes then impacted the female fans. So what was it like being a fan of Black Flag and the Dead Kennedys in America in the 80s? What is it like to be a female fan of pop punk, and be a 13-year-old listening to Blink-182 songs or the Donnas, etc.? So it was really less about just listing kind of the musicians and the great albums and all of that, but really interrogating the good and the bad aspects of how punkers responded and impacted to its female fans. So how feminist has punk been? That was the ultimate aim of the book, really.
Like with the scene, I mean, has it genuinely improved for women? I mean, it's just I've always felt as well from being, because I started getting into punk in the 90s because I'm like mid 90s, and I just feel like maybe only just recently it started changing for us. Not too much though, and I still feel like a lot of the time women who you think may be allies aren't as much of an ally as you think they are. Because I came out with a term, you've probably heard of it, male-centered women, who would be on a man's side above all else, even against you. I mean, against, like say if something happened, it'd be, they'd take their side over yours. How do you find all of that? Like in recent times, has things changed? Do you think it's getting better?
Yeah, I definitely do, and I think people do ask me a lot about, because I'm still currently writing about punk, so I'm still am an active music journalist in that sense. So I still get sent a lot of music. I review music, so I feel like I'm still listening to new stuff and kind of getting I was going to say finger on the pulse, but that sounded really naff, like, oh, a 40-year-old woman as I am. Oh, I've got my finger on the pulse of what all the new bands doing. But I'm still really love hearing new bands, and just you do, when you read so many press releases and you listen to lots of new stuff, you do pick up on like themes and patterns, and there's things that are reoccurring, and so you pick up on that. And people do ask me sometimes that what's the sort of state of punk, I guess, now, and specifically now that Rebel Grrrls is out, about sort of women's place in the scene. And I'm always really optimistic about it. But I think you could have asked me this even if I was around in the 70s or the 80s, and I probably would have said the same thing, because the part of the woven into the book is, I was aware that people might, they don't like, for good reason, punk to be just this homogenous word. So if I say, punk is this, understandably, people will respond, well, what punk are you talking about? Because it's not just one thing. And really, it's not even a thing. It's more just a collection of bands and people and fans and things. There's things that unite it, but it's not just one thing. So in the conclusion of the book, bit of a spoiler alert maybe, but I say that I was trying to work out through the book, is punk feminist, and have some waves or scenes or of punk been more feminist than others? And that the answer is, well, it depends. It depends where you are, when you are, who you're with, what your values are, etc. And what might have at first seemed like people can write off something like US hardcore and say, oh, it was very macho, it was very much a boys' club. It wasn't the best in terms of women's representation on stage, but a lot of the women that I spoke to for the book, their experience when they were actually there at the time, they viewed things differently, because they saw that there were lots of female promoters and photographers, and there were women in bands, but they just maybe haven't stood the test of time in the way that, we know about Black Flag and Dead Kennedys. For every punk band that we know, decades on, there are, countless that never unfortunately made it out of a garage or sort of local venue. So every punk is very vibrant and eclectic and diverse, and I think women have always found a place in punk, if I'm generalizing a bit, but it has also always been a little bit more of a struggle than I think some other histories of punk will acknowledge. So part of the impetus for writing the book was really because I was starting to get a little bit, I was going to say, frustrated. I was getting a little bit frustrated that I feel like a lot of discussions around punk or books about it, or there's a lot of love for it that just makes out like it's been perfect this whole time. So It was anti-racist from the start, anti-sexist from the start, it was inclusive, it was accessible, it was ahead of its time, it was progressive everywhere for every person. And I think that those are things that punk probably can be very proud of. It's one of the reasons I love punk, but I just think it's not really that simple, and that I know now from speaking to a lot of the contributors for the book that they were relieved that this book is being written to actually maybe just and interrogate these assumptions a little bit more. So it hasn't, punk has had a problem with sexism and misogyny in the same way that you could take any other area of society and you would also find those things. So it's not necessarily that punk is worse than anywhere else, but it sort of says it's much better than other places, and therefore I wanted to sort of interrogate that a bit more. But in terms of where we're at now, some of the things that I pick out from in the last chapter, which is kind of looking ahead, is that I think there is more of a supportive environment maybe for women to get involved in punk, in terms of a lot of the punk that I listen to now that gets sent to me. There are lots of bands that are, calling out sexism, misogyny, toxic masculinity, all of those kinds of things. There are lots more now. We're much more open as a society in talking about violence against women and girls and things like that. So those attitudes have changed. I think some of the most radical punk music now is being made by women or gender non-conforming artists, which is great. And punk is as good as it ever was. Every week I listen to a band that I think, this is my new favourite band, I love this band now. And then next week I'm like, oh no, actually, this is my new favourite band, I love this band. So I always want to push back against anyone that says, oh, punk died in 1977 and everything's been shit ever since, because I think you are not listening to the same things that I'm listening to, because whatever you're into, I do like a more poppy, I like pop punk and poppier melodic punk, but even if you like shoegazy, punky, scrungy stuff, or you like proper hardcore, more on the thrash sort of side of things, it's all having some resurgence at the moment. So you just got to keep your ears open. So yeah, I am very optimistic that if any genre can deal with the shitstorm that is the current state of the world, including for women, then it is going to be punk. And I want to see more people involved in the catharsis that punk can give them, basically.
Yeah, do you know
that
what?
was a really long, unwieldy answer. I apologise for it. I don't even know if I even answered your initial question. Hopefully I got there in the end.
Oh no, I sort of went off on a tangent myself, but I agree with what you say. I think if any scene can help you sort of process and understand things and find allies, it's going to be punk, isn't it?
Yeah,
because I don't mean to generalise under the whole punk umbrella, because as you said, like, there's always different facets, isn't there, of punk. But I kind of feel like you do find a lot of like-minded people who are quite switched on, who are in tune with the world and what's going on, and you can talk to them. It's like sometimes when you're out in the street, like I spend a lot of time at football because my oldest plays football. I'm talking to other parents, and some of them don't even know who the Damned are. They've never heard of the Damned, and they just don't like, the state of the world just seems to pass them by unless it affects them. And I find that quite sad. And then you kind of, it's like you don't want to go too much into things because you're like, oh, I could end up starting an argument at the side of training here, and I don't really know if I've got the energy for that today. I do question things. I'm like, oh, what would you do? I try and what's the word? I try and like judge the situation.
Yeah.
But with punkers, we don't. It's like we don't really have to do that unless somebody's like an outright racist sort of. I don't know though. Don't know. Do you have to judge it at some gigs? Do you have to like get the lay of the land when you're going to see a band? Is there some?
I think so. I think the elephant in the room sometimes around punk now is that, and I wrote something about this on Punk Rock Philosophy, just spurred on by the fact that even now I think maybe there is not maybe divide is too strong a word, but I've left a lot of Facebook groups that were like just generic kind of punk fan groups, because I don't think you can now assume, particularly online, and particularly with maybe sort of certain sections of punk fandom, that they would share my values. So, for example, you know, there are punks now involved in the scene that, in terms of fans, that I would say are saying racist things, or they are sexist. And they're, some of the women that I spoke to for Rebel Grrrls, not all of this made it into the book, but a lot of them would give examples of how they were in, let's say, sort of social media groups. And people might say, well, that's not real life because that's just a social media group. But I think if somebody is willing to put something in these groups, then, it's indicative of what they think. But anyway, they would say that, the things that were quite sexist or misogynistic or objectifying would be shared in those spaces. And if they critiqued them or said, actually there are a lot of women in this group, or just people that might find this quite offensive, then there's a kind of maybe subset of punk fans who were like, oh, lighten up, it's about being shocking. And so I don't think that it's now always a given that someone might share your ideals because they like punk, which is another thing that prompted me, I guess, to write Rebel Grrrls. There have been some high profile punk singers who have moved a bit to the right. I think the obvious one maybe being, I'm just going to invite probably a lot of pushback on this, but John Lydon has obviously said a lot of things recently that wouldn't be compatible with my politics. Luckily, I've never been a Sex Pistols fan anyway, so I don't mind saying I didn't feel any sense of loss on that. But I feel like for a lot of people for whom he was a big idol, that puts them in a position of defending the indefensible, I think, a lot of the time, because he holds such a special, influential place in their history. So that's probably a whole other discussion about what we do when people that we kind of idolise turn out maybe to, go in a different direction. But it was something that when I was at Rebellion a few years ago, Bob Vylan were headlining, I think, the Empress Ballroom, and they talked about this to the audience, and it got quite a mixed response. So they were talking about the fact that, punk maybe has been able to rest on this idea that it's progressive and it's anti-racist, and that hasn't necessarily been their experience, and it kind of got a bit of a mixed response from the crowd. So I wrote a piece of punk rock philosophy about how when punks say that they are anti-authority, what authority are they talking about? Because I've seen a lot of punk fans saying that actually they thought it was more punk to support somebody like Donald Trump or to support someone like Nigel Farage because they are more punk politicians because they're against the establishment, which I find a very peculiar argument, that Donald Trump or Nigel Farage would be considered anti-establishment. But it got me to thinking, how people who identify as punk sort of reconcile their politics with that, or whether the two things are completely separate. So I think a lot of people can listen to punk music and enjoy the music, but it doesn't necessarily reflect anything about their politics. But then I wonder if I saw somebody wearing a Dead Kennedys t-shirt, I might make an immediate assumption that we might have a lot of things in common in terms of our politics, but that might not be the case.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, me and Lorik were talking about how read some of the things online, and I try and stay away from the arguments of stuff. But how some people you'll see that they're a fan of, like, say, the Clash, but then they'll come out with all this Nigel Farage supporting comments, and you're like, hang on a moment, it's like, as you said, you can't assume. It's one of my favourite things, because I just find it fascinating, is when there'll be like something like a news story about a punk politician, a punk musician coming out against ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement in America. So there were things where Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine or Ken Casey from the Dropkick Murphys, have come out
really being against Trump and ICE and all those kinds of Republican politics. And I go straight to the comments whenever I see stuff like that, and it'll be people saying, "Oh, I used to be a really big Dropkick Murphys fan, but if it turns out they're going to be political and get involved in politics, then I'm not going to listen to them anymore." And I think, when have you ever listened to a band like the Dropkick Murphys and not picked up on the fact that they're political? Because they've been political from their inception. And people saying, "Oh, I used to be a really big Rage Against the Machine fan, but not anymore, not if they're left wing." And like, what?
Yeah.
What were you,
exactly.
what have you been listening to? And it's the same with, with bands like The Clash as well. If someone was to say, "Oh, I didn't realise that this is what Joe Strummer stood for," and actually, now I'm not going to listen to them and enjoy them in the same way. I think, I don't know what you've been listening to up until then, because not all punk is political, but a lot of it is. And there are a lot of people, I think, that are claiming that they were really big fans of bands, but clearly didn't take on board the messaging that was important to those bands as well.
Yeah, and the reading of the lyrics as well, and really listening to the lyrics and listening to what the bands were saying, like the messages in the music, the messages in the words, and it wasn't, it just becomes apparent. It's just,
I think a lot of people, I think that people can listen to music and not, I think you could listen to The Clash and I think there are people that would listen to bands, enjoy the music, but they're not internalising, the message behind the art. And I think it's not how I engage with punk, because actually I've done the opposite, in that it's been a hugely influential part of my life, because I have it really taken on board a lot of the values that I think are, expressed in the music as well. But I can understand that maybe not everybody does engage with punk in that way. But then I think that then they're really missing out, because to me that's the reason I devote so much time and thought. I think about punk just every day. I'm writing something about punk, or I'm listening to it, and it's a joy and a privilege to do that, because I have found it so enriching for my life. I don't think I would be the same person that I am now without it. And so if other people haven't got that from the music, then, I think that's a shame.
yeah, I agree with you there. It's and I also think as well, like, I think sometimes your life experiences of things can affect the way you listen to stuff in a certain way. Like if you've experienced like sexism, racism, and discrimination, you tend to pick up on bands that talk about these things that you can relate to.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why representation is really important, and that's why it can be really, really powerful to hear experiences that you relate to in a song, and maybe sung by or performed by people that you relate to and that resonate with you. And that's part of, a lot of people talk about punk as a kind of community, and that those sort of community-based values and solidarity, and I think that those are really important and powerful parts of punk. But I think it goes beyond like just the practical organization of a community, and can just be almost like a community, an emotional community, in that you listen to bands and songs that make you feel less alone. So even if you're, a lot of the people that I've spoken to for Rebel Grrrls and for other things that I've written, punk fans talk about, maybe growing up in quite small villages or small towns, or they were the only punk in their school, for example. So maybe like that physical community was something that came a bit later, but even just hearing bands that were singing about things that, they were feeling as well, gave them almost, a virtual community, in the sense that at least they could listen to those albums and think, someone else out there feels the same way as I do. And I think it's quite powerful to be seen in that way.
Yeah, definitely. I hear that. I mean, I remember being the only punk in my school, and there was alternative people. Like there was, I'd like a lot of my friends were goths, so they were into metal, and we sort of banded together and sort of
You
looked after it.
merged.
We merged and
Yeah.
we listened to each other's music, and that's what it was like. I'd say in the early to mid 90s, it was a bit like that, because I think from what I remember, punk was very American at the time. A lot of it was all, Rancid and Green Day. And I'll don't get me wrong, like I like Green Day. I've got some issues with Rancid though, but which I'll probably get crucified for. But you probably know what they are. I can.
Well, I thought, I mean, I've talked about in the book about, Brody Dalle from the Distillers
Yeah, I
and her
love Distillers.
relationship with Tim Armstrong, and that by all accounts, that wasn't a very healthy relationship, and I think that there's a lot to unpick there in how she was treated by it was an example that I used to challenge this idea that punk isn't sexist, has never been sexist, and if it is, it isn't really punk, and all of this kind of circular argument. But I talked to, because this would have been around, I was the right age for this to be happening and for me to be paying attention to it in the music press, that when Brody and Tim Armstrong separated, there was a lot of over the top vitriol towards her from
I
Rancid
remember.
fans, and I think that
Yeah.
raises it was one of my first examples, I think, without having the language to understand it, that there was some parasocial relationships that people have with bands and musicians that they like, that lead them to maybe do and say things and defend things that normally you probably wouldn't. But the way she was treated, and still is
Yeah. I see it.
is treated, I think, and it's the same with Courtney Love, and there's a whole section in the book about Courtney Love, in that it's not even about them specifically, but about what it represents in terms of the dynamics of how a lot of male fans might respond to certain relationship dynamics for artists that they like. There's a whole lot to unpick there. Again, I don't want to give too many spoilers in the book, but I think there is a cycle of Nancy Spungen, Courtney Love, Brody Dalle, all of these women being villainized
Definitely.
in a very over the top way. And why is that? I think we have to examine that there are that's rooted in some real kind of sexist ideas. So don't worry. So if anyone's going to attract the ire of Rancid fans, then it's probably going to be me. So
Oh, don't. I've had it myself with. Obviously not. I feel really, really sad now talking about this, because like me, I don't know if you know, but I've been in bands, and a few years ago I was like, very obviously it's very small scale, like within our local sort of scene, like London and stuff. I was involved in a domestic abuse case. I had to get restraining orders against my ex-husband. I moved into a refuge. I was in two bands at the time, and one of them wasn't very supportive, and the other one was. And I had a lot. I had a lot of stick. I was called all sorts of names. I was called a liar. I mean, even up until very recently. This happened. God, this was like 14, 13 years ago. But even to recently, I've had to watch where I go, because I had a lot of venom online. I had a lot of people say a lot of nasty things about me, and I'd sort of, when I saw like when I see all the stuff with Nancy and Brody and with Courtney, I really feel for them, because I've experienced that on a small scale, and people who I thought would know better, because I've always been involved in like animal rights, like anti-fur, very much an issues-based person, and then all these people who I thought would support me really turned their backs on me.
I'm sorry that happened to you, Marie. That sounds awful. And it's unfortunately, having worked in this arena for a long time. It's been 16 years that I've worked, around sort of domestic abuse and sexual violence and stuff like that. And I just spend a lot of my day, because I deliver training now, so I'm not frontline anymore. I train people that are frontline. A lot of things talking about victim blaming and talking about what are our the myths and stereotypes and assumptions that we make that are unhelpful for people who are trying to make themselves safe and who have experienced these kinds of things. And it's relevant to the book as well, because when I talk about Brody, but also it's mainly in the emo chapter when I'm talking about the fact that emo, which was never I would personally was never an emo fan, so that I was coming at this, sort of relying on a lot of the people that I spoke to as fans in terms of the impact that emo, which has had a lot of revision in terms of its impact, looking at the misogyny that is being criticised a lot now for being quite a sexist and misogynistic little enclave, the sort of third wave emo, which we get to in sort of the 2000s, in terms of the lyrical content, the fact it was very male centric, but also the lyrical content, which I'll give a lot of examples of, were glamorizing kind of unhealthy relationship dynamics. And because my background professionally is more around sort of young people and their relationships, their intimate partner relationships, it is relevant how people see things being dealt with in popular culture. So if you are someone, if there's someone that is thinking of reaching out and confiding in their community, or looking at maybe sort of disclosing something that's happened to them, or making an allegation about someone, they will be aware of how that's being received when other people do that. So if you have got people making death threats towards Brody Dalle because she's no longer, with Tim Armstrong, what message is that sending? Part of Rebel Grrrls is thinking beyond the obvious of what happened, and what, for fans, what messages are you then internalizing? Because when I was a teenager in the late 90s and I was listening to a lot of pop punk, I was internalizing certain messages that were in that was in that music without even really knowing it. It's only now that I've gotten a bit older that I can listen to certain songs by Blink-182 or whatever, who I love. I absolutely love Blink-182. They were one of my favourite bands, and I still listen to them now. But some of their songs, I'm like, I can't believe that I didn't pick up on this when I was 14, but this is a bit dodge. So it is relevant, I think, all of these things. If you're a fan of something, you are absorbing lots of things from whatever it is that you're a fan of. And some of those things will be really good, and most of the book is really positive about, and I've interviewed female fans who are talking about all the positive things punk has given them, but also we're talking about areas where it doesn't always hit the mark, and where they have experienced things that haven't been dealt with by the scene or very well, or certain messages and certain bands and songs that impact female fans maybe in a negative way. And I think that one of the good things about punk is I'm pretty sure it's robust enough to take that kind of criticism. The Rebel Grrrls isn't going to bring down punk in any way, but hopefully it will make people a bit more analytical about it maybe, and think what does it look like to be anti-racist and anti-sexist, and create safe spaces and be accessible. I think that's the next challenge for it, really.
Do you think if the same book was written 50 years in the future? I mean, I like to think we'll be alive, but I'm pushing 50. I doubt I'll be here.
I've been 90, so I might be. Fingers crossed.
Oh God, yeah, I'll be.
If the world is still here in 50 years, I'm not so much like thinking about like whether I'll survive it, but will humanity survive another 50 years? Yeah. That's a conversation for another time. But yeah, I'd like to think so. I mean, I've spoke to somebody. Someone interviewed me a little while ago, just when the book first came out, and said, sort of off the record, that I found the book a little bit depressing in some aspects of it, in that there were themes that were around in the 70s that women and racially minoritized people or, you know, parts of the LGBT community were dealing with, that you would have thought, fast forward 50 years, everything would have been solved by this point.
I get that, yeah.
But I think things like that aren't linear. And I think one of the things that I wish we didn't have to have this lesson, but I think what we are having lessons in now is that whatever progress is made and whatever rights you gain, it's not a given that you're going to keep them, and it's not a given that you're going to keep that progress. So things can bounce back. So it's kind of just being aware, I guess, or alive to the fact that it's a kind of constant struggle, I guess, to fight for your rights, to make sure they're not trampled on, to try and get some dignity and safety in this world. But it's always a fight that's worth having. And with punk, because punk is, for the most part, taking part in that fight, the solidarity that you can get in punk is one of its sort of strongest features, really. So yes, we are seeing that certain rights and progress is being rolled back, but I think punk is there for, you know, is trying to sort of stem that a lot. So I feel quite optimistic that punk will often be in general, punk will be on the right side of things.
Yeah.
I've written about L7, but so they're in the 90s chapter, but I hadn't really. I interviewed fans of bands like L7, but never spoke to Jennifer Finch directly. But you know, obviously, we've just had the terrible news.
No.
Which was really, I think, a shock, and yeah, just incredibly sad. It's been really moving seeing all the tributes to her. As well, and a lot of people, including friends of mine, talking about how you know, inspirational she's been, and that they, you know, made her want to join a band, or she was just this really sort of positive figure. So it's it's really sad. It's one of the things that has come up in the response to the book, of people saying that it's you know, hopefully shining a light on women's contribution to the genre, and beyond just the music as well. So also, you know, all of their work as promoters and say photographers and writers, and you know, organisers and activists, and just fans as well. Because I also feel really strongly that, you know, any music scene or any successful anything really is driven in culture, is driven by fans. So also, even if you're not in a band yourself, you're not in a punk band yourself, if you are going to gigs and listening to albums and you're supporting the scene, it couldn't have really survived without that either. So I wanted to kind of honour fans' contributions as well for keeping something going, because if there were no fans, if there were only bands, then there'd be nobody in the audience. So it'd be a pretty lackluster gig if you didn't have any fans in the audience. So yeah, I think hopefully it's somebody described the book as a kind of love letter to fans and being a fan, and I would like to think of it as that. But lots of stuff had to be edited out. So I'm well aware. I put a little disclaimer in the introduction saying that, just trying to get ahead of people reading the book and thinking the person that I wanted to see mentioned in this book hasn't been mentioned. And so I put a little sort of disclaimer in the introduction saying I couldn't possibly, in the word count that I had, and I had to cover, 50 years of punk, that there might be some artists that don't either get mentioned, or people might feel like, oh, there could have been a bit more word count spent on that. But I wanted to avoid it. I wanted to get a balance of, for those that might not read it and might not know loads about punk, I wanted to make sure that they would come away with lots to research things that they were interested in, which is why I put a playlist at the back as well. So if people want a they're like, oh, I'm new, I don't really know a lot of these bands, or I don't know where to start. There's a playlist at the back, a punk playlist. But also I had to, just edit out some things that people talked about, or, artists that I wanted to devote a bit more time to, just purely for the word count and the length of the book.
Yeah, no, I get that, because I obviously with the podcast as well, I've got to do a lot of editing, and
You've got to do a lot of editing. Yeah, that's the most brutal part. It's the hardest part.
doing these
Yeah.
things.
I remember when I started with punctuation. Punctuation was started by a guy called Matt Wallace, who was a music journalist. When things were being printed, so sort of back in the day, in the sort of 80s and 90s, and he started Punctuation as a website, and so he was the editor-in-chief, and this was the first. I'd had something published in Viva La Rock, which I was really, really chuffed about. But Punctuation was the first place where I was like regularly writing these features. So he was letting me know what the kind of industry standards were, I guess. And I said I can't remember what I'd written, but I was like, I've written this piece about this really big topic in punk. And he was like, right, okay, well, just to let you know, as a guide, for those kinds of features, we wouldn't go above like 1,500, 1,800 words. Like after that, it's just too long for people to really read. And he was like, what's your current word count on this? And I was like, just looking in the corner, 4,500. And he was like, yeah, you're gonna have to edit that down a bit, Molly, because that's a lot for an article. I was like, I had no idea. I was like, oh, okay. So then you go through, and actually cutting things out is like the hardest part.
Yeah, it is.
Because then you feel like there's a domino effect in that, well, if I cut this bit out, this other bit's not going to make any sense.
I get that.
And it was like that with the book. That then, you work with the publisher has an editor. So she went through, she was great. It had 2 rounds of edits, one with Zoe Howe and one with Claire Brown, and both were, great. That they go through and say, oh, I'm not sure about this bit, might have just duplicated something, or you could do without it. And then you think, okay, but if I cut that out, then the next sentence isn't going to make any sense. So then I'll have to change that, and then that's going to like ruin the flow. So now I've got to move that back here, and it just becomes this whole like can of worms once you start editing.
A friend of mine suggested just limit it to an hour, and then just talk for an hour, and then just put it straight up. And it's like, it don't quite work like that, because
but I wouldn't even know. I mean, I feel like it's probably a lot easier to do it with words on a page, but I wouldn't have the like tech know-how that you would have to do it with like sound and all that sort of thing.
I was going to do like visuals and sound as well, but I've realised as well, I've sort of put my own like position on it. Like when I have a podcast on, even on YouTube, I can't just sit there and watch it. I get up and I do stuff, and I'm sort of, when I speak to people who like download the podcast, they'll be doing the gardening, they'll be doing the cooking whilst they're listening, and sitting down and watching it. But then you've got the odd person who likes that visual, so you just do what you do, don't you?
Yeah, exactly. You can't please everybody. You can't be all things to all people. You just got to make a decision sometimes and be like, this is just what it is.
Would you say writing the books changed you?
Yeah, I think it's given me a lot of more confidence, because I think there's a real imposter syndrome with, why would anybody really want to read a book that I've written, basically? And then, and I still get that sometimes, in that if someone says that they've read the book, I'm like, really? Have you seriously read it? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, really? That's mad that you would read something that I've written. But it made me more confident that, I think I'm more confident that I've got things that I think are worthwhile to say about a genre that I am part of. I think part of that imposter syndrome is something that maybe women feel a lot, in that I had a necklace custom made she doesn't make these. It was like an Etsy shop. She's not around anymore, but it says more punk than you. And the reason I got that made was because I felt like I was just being, anytime I mentioned that I liked punk or I write about punk, you depend, if it's someone you don't know very well, sometimes I felt like I was always being tested or interrogated somehow.
Yeah.
Like, oh, do you really know about punk though? And I feel like that is something that women get more. I don't think it's exclusively something that only happens to women, but I feel like that whole name three songs phenomenon when you're wearing a t-shirt by a band is something that women experience more than men. Again, not exclusively. So now I'm a bit more I'm more confident in that. No, I am part of this scene. I write about it. I know a lot about it. I did have spent years researching this book. I've made a lot of, I've got a network in this. I've done the hours. I do my bit to promote new bands, to shine a spotlight on all the good things that punk does. I'm in there. I'm in the trenches. I'm doing my bit for the scene. But it also made me reflect in a good way about how much the genre has given me, and on personally, about as a person. I feel now quite. The last bit of in the sort of conclusion of the book, we had the launch event at Rough Trade, I had to read a bit of it out, and it actually made me feel a bit emotional, which might be a bit sad, about thinking about. I've always wanted to be a good person. I've always thought, am I a good person? Do I do good things? Do I make the world better? And I don't think I would have that. The reason that I ask myself that on a daily basis, I think, is because punk has inspired me to be a good person. So I think writing the book has been able to get that all straight in my head and kind of reconcile how influential punk has been. And the other way that it's changed my life is I've made some really cool friends from talking to, some really cool people that are doing things and have done things that are infinitely cooler and more inspiring than anything I've ever done, I'm sure, all over the world. And that's been probably the most rewarding part of the whole thing, just the amount of generosity that people have had that I didn't expect. When I'd say, like, would you like to be interviewed for my book, and talk to me about being a punk fan? And some people would talk for hours and hours and tell me all these stories and share photos with me. So the photos haven't made it into the book, in terms of what was sent to me, but one person that I interviewed for the book, Sally, I'm going to give her a shout out. She donated her physical copies of Maximum Rock and Roll and Punk Planet zines. I've now got this massive collection. It turned up at my house in these two huge, really heavy boxes, and I had no idea she was sending them to me. And I was like, oh my God, what's in these boxes? And I opened it up, and it was just all of these zines from the 90s, from America and stuff. And just, moments like that, I think, made all of the stress of writing a book and editing it worthwhile. So it's just been a fantastic experience. And being able to speak to people like you, Marie, it's just a gift that keeps on giving. So I'm just really grateful at the moment for everything that it's done for me.
How did you get the people from the book? Did you put an ad out, or did you just contact random people? How did you meet them all?
All of the above. I did do, lots of shout outs on social media. This was back when I was before Twitter went the way that it did. So before Musk took over, and it was a lot more of a nice musical community on there. I'm not on Twitter anymore, but when I was, I would do shout outs on there and Facebook. I had some leaflets printed. I'm going to see, I know this isn't video, but I'm going to see if I've got any to hand. I had these like physical flyers printed. Oh, I don't think I'm going to be able to find them, but I had these physical flyers printed that were like, are you a punk fan? Are you a female punk fan? Would you like to be involved in my project? And I just went outside gigs and just handed them to people, and left them in public places to see if people responded. And but then sometimes I reached out. Some of it was word of mouth. So I'd speak to someone and they'd say, you should speak to my friend. She did X, Y, and Z. And then I would sort of go and speak to them. So a lot of it was face to face. I travelled all over the place, all over the UK, meeting people. Some of it was over the phone. Some of it was like online, like Zoom, particularly over COVID. I was seeing people a lot on Zoom. And then sometimes I did need something quite specific. So I would try and infiltrate certain fan groups. So I really needed to speak to someone that was a big fan of Hayley Williams and Paramore at the time that Paramore became really big. I wanted quite a specific fan insight. So I had to go hunting for somebody that would be that person. So I was joining like, you know, Paramore fan groups and being like, hi, does anyone want to talk to me about Hayley Williams? So yeah, a few different ways really. It was, and because I'm in the UK and a lot of the book is about US punk as well, and I needed people that were contemporaneous. So I you know, for the 80s chapter in America, I wanted to speak to people that were there at that time, and those aren't really naturally part of my network. So that I had to do a bit of digging for that. So it was that was the most work, I think, trying to actually find people. And then I took some time off my day job in order to conduct a lot of interviews and get them all written up and things like that. So it was quite laborious, but it was definitely worth it.
Yeah, do you know what? I've not read the book yet 'cause it takes me ages to read stuff. And I'm working my way through, you know, the Poison Girls book by
Yeah,
Richard
yeah.
Cross. So I'm on that at the minute, and that's taking me months to read because I've got dyslexia. So things do take me a long time to read. So yeah, it's in my pile to read.
Yeah, no, I
So
know. There's too many good books to read. I've
oh, there's
always got a
so
massive
many.
to be read pile. There's just so many.
There is so many, and I'm thankful for that, and I'm thankful for like the information and, you know, like the time and the love and the effort that you've put into the books to get everything out there, because I think it's really really important. Because before, I think in the past 10 years or so, a load of different books about punk have come through. It might even have been longer than that because I'm thinking about Ian Glasper as well. I think he sort of kick-started it in a way, because before then you just had like all these books based on the 1970s and then that was it, and you had like this big
Yeah,
massive gap, and then you had the Burning Britain book, and slowly but surely everyone started coming out and, you know, writing books and talking more and different periods. Like I always had to speak up for the 90s, because in some people's minds, like even when I was in the Lost Cherries, there's somebody I was in the band with who was like, oh, nothing happened in the 90s. And I had to remind, because I was obviously like yourself, as like a teenager, and I was like, I was like 20 in the year 2000, all of that, so that was my teenage years. So I had to be like, I had to talk about the squat gigs that used to happen, and like, I mean, there's a lot of American bands, but there's still bands in the UK as well that maybe didn't weren't as to the forefront as they could have
yeah,
been, you know. And yeah, so we used to have those discussions. But I think, you know, a lot of people were like teenagers in the 80s would have like start having children in the 90s, so they'd miss out. So I get that. And social media wasn't around then. I mean, I've sort of kept, even through having my kids, I've sort of kept up to date with stuff because of social media. If social media hadn't been around, I think it would have been a different story for me, you know, if that makes sense. I would have been like, there's
yeah.
nothing going on in this. It's all died, and it wouldn't be that, you know.
It's definitely one of the things when because the book covers such a big time period. So it's, you know, it's got to be a sort of whistle stop tour in some respects to the sort of overarching kind of dominant scenes and things. And when it was one the 70s chapter was kind of the hardest to write, in the sense that I just didn't want to reiterate what has already been written quite a lot about the 70s. So I, even though that obviously wasn't my era, as in I wasn't there at the time because I was born in 86, but I do like a lot of those. So I first got into bands like The Clash, and I love, you know, the Undertones, and I love the Buzzcocks, and I love the Ramones and all of that. And Blondie, I love Blondie. But I think the 70s has been written about a lot. So I think that's one of the things that was challenging, but also because I was writing about the fan perspective, I feel like that gave it like a fresher look. And I didn't want to just reiterate the Sex Pistols formed in this year and then this happened and everything was brilliant from then on. And then as the time goes on, there is less and less written about those eras. You know, there's a lot written about the 80s punk scene, the hardcore punk scene, but maybe less than there is the 70s. And then when you get to the 90s, there's a lot written about Riot Grrrl, maybe, but not so much about how Riot Grrrl then led to pop punk. There's even less written about emo, and you know, as we get further into the future, there's sort of less and less written about these. So that was something that was fun to write about, in that it's hopefully saying things or covering things that haven't been done 100 times already. There's nothing I could say about Susie and the Banshees, or you know, the Sex Pistols, that probably hasn't already been said, in terms of the music and sort of the facts of, you know, when they started and stuff. But I think the fan perspective, what was it, you know, what did people like about Susie Sue, and what was it like seeing being there in London, or not even in London actually, but what was it like when punk was happening and you are a young woman that lives in Salisbury or lives in Leicester or whatever. So hopefully there's fresh perspectives there, because I don't want to just reiterate what's already been written.
Quick fire round. So,
Yeah.
First punk record.
The first punk record, I don't know if you would class this as punk. The first album I bought was, with my own money, was Manic Street Preachers' Everything Must Go. They did get me into punk, but I know not people probably wouldn't class them as a punk band. Therefore, I'm probably going to have to say that it was when I got really into The Clash, and it was probably a bit of a cliche, but it was probably London Calling.
First gig. It could be anything. It
My
doesn't have to be punk.
first gig was not a punk gig. It was the Lightning Seeds, who I do actually love. It was the Lightning Seeds at Portsmouth Guildhall in 97, 96 or 97.
Band that everybody should listen to.
Everybody should listen to the Donners. They're one of my favourite bands. Everybody should listen to the Donners. From, you know, they're not around anymore, so this is more sort of my era. Modern times, you know, I think everyone should listen to who are my favourites now. Sincere Engineer.
Most underrated punk women.
I'm going to say the Donners. So I know everyone that knows me is bored of me talking about the Donners. I know that. But it's not going to stop me, because they were around in the, you know, the pop punk era. They were they had a really interesting place in that whole kind of, you know, subgenre. They were really influential to me. I took up playing drums because I thought their drummer was the coolest woman I'd ever seen in my life, Tori Castellano. And just this morning, I'm pitching to write an article revisiting their album Turn 21, which was released 25 years ago, because I don't feel like it got the recognition it deserved at the time.
Favourite punk lyric?
Do you know what? My favourite punk lyric, I think the opening line to Blank Generation by Richard Hell and the Voidoids, I just always, when I hear it, think that is genius. And I think the opening is, I was saying let me out of here before I was even born. It's such a gamble when you get a face. That is the best opening line of a punk song ever.
And one myth about punk you'd like to quash?
That it finished, that all of the good stuff happened in 1977, and everything since then hasn't been punk. That is a myth. Punk has completely reinvented itself constantly. There are bands subverting the genre and keeping it going all over the world. And it's as vibrant and relevant now as it ever was. And there is so much great music that if you aren't hearing it, then you've got your ears plugged, because it's still absolutely thriving. It's not going anywhere anytime soon. It's only just got started, I think.
So yeah, do you know what? Thank you for your time. And
Oh no, thank you for yours. It's been a pleasure. What a way to spend a Thursday night. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Punk Rock Creators Podcast, and we'll see you next time. Bye.